Chapter 1. Born in Blood. Pain. That was the first thing he felt. A sharp, tearing sensation burned through his body, as if his very flesh were being unraveled and stitched back together in ways it was never meant to be. His breath hitched, and his vision swam in darkness. He couldn't move, he couldn't scream. Then came the whispers. Low, guttural voices slithered through his mind like 1,000 writhing worms, each word soaked in malice and hunger. They called to him, welcomed him, and then, he fell. He slammed into something hard, his body twisting painfully on impact. He gasped, finally able to breathe. A rancid stench filled his nostrils, iron, decay, death. He forced his eyes open. He was lying in a pit. The walls were slick with something dark and glistening. Corpses surrounded him, twisted and broken, their hollow eyes staring into nothing. Some were fresh, their wounds still wet. Others were nothing but bones. Panic flared in his chest, but then, ding, a translucent screen flickered into existence before his eyes. You have awakened. Your soul has been marked by the abyss. Skill unlocked. Fleshbound summoning. Unique. All those who perish in your presence may serve. Shape them. Bind them. Command them. A shiver ran through him. The words pulsed in his vision, sinking deep into his mind like instinct. His heart pounded. His hands trembled. A unique skill? What the hell was this? Something moved in the pile of bodies. A low squelching noise, like wet meat shifting. He scrambled back, pressing himself against the slick pit wall. One of the corpses, a man with half his face missing, was rising. His flesh twisted unnaturally, bone grinding against bone. His lips peeled back in a grotesque grin. He had summoned it. A second screen blinked into existence. Minion created. Lesser fleshborn, form. Unstable, loyalty. Absolute, limitations. His breath hitched. His power, it worked on the dead. He should have been terrified. He should have been sick. Instead, something in him clicked. He stared at the risen corpse, at the way its flesh still wriggled, waiting for his will. This was power. Above him, footsteps echoed. Voices. Someone was coming. He grinned. Time to see what his new creation could do. Chapter 2. The first command. Footsteps crunched above the pit, followed by the low murmur of voices. Still breathing, huh? A gruff voice muttered. A metallic scrape echoed through the air, a blade being drawn. Figured he'd be worm food by now, another voice replied, thick with amusement. We could still carve him up, sell the good parts. A chuckle followed, dark and callous. Thomas Felthorne, though the name did not yet surface in his fractured mind, lay frozen among the corpses. His body ached, muscles stiff from whatever torment had led him here, but his instincts screamed at him. They think I'm helpless. But he wasn't. Not anymore. He felt the creature beside him, the fleshborn, a grotesque thing of sinew and bone, stitched together by his will. Its presence was like a second heartbeat in his mind, a silent sentinel awaiting his command. A thrill shot through him. Kill them. The fleshborn moved in a blur of unnatural speed. Its fingers, clawed and jagged, dug into the pit wall, dragging itself upward in a series of rapid, jerking motions. The wet sound of shifting flesh filled the silence. What the fuck is? A scream. The first man barely had time to react before the fleshborn landed atop him, claws sinking into his throat. Blood sprayed in a dark arc. The second man stumbled back, eyes wide with horror as he fumbled for his weapon. Too slow. The fleshborn lunged again, a sickening crack ringing out as its fist smashed into the man's skull. His body collapsed, twitching violently before going still. Silence. Thomas stared, his breath heavy. The corpses at his feet were fresh, and in his mind, he felt it again, that pull, that hunger. Ding. You have absorbed fallen flesh. New summon available. Boneguard, lesser. Thomas exhaled, pulse racing. Another summon. He focused, and the corpses twisted. Flesh peeled away, bones shifting, snapping, reforming. In moments, a second creature rose beside the fleshborn. This one was different, leaner, its skeletal frame sharpened into jagged spikes. Its ribcage curved outward like barbs, its fingers elongated into clawed spears of bone. His creation stood before him, waiting. Silent, obedient. Power thrummed through his veins. He had been thrown into a pit to die. Now, he was climbing out, dripping in blood and commanding monsters. He grinned. The escape, the night air was thick with rot and smoke. Thomas pulled himself over the pit's edge, boots sinking into the damp earth. His eyes flicked upward. A camp sprawled before him, a ragged collection of tents and wooden barricades, their edges lit by flickering torches. The corpses in the pit weren't random. This was a bandit camp, and these bastards had thrown him away like garbage. Mistake. His gaze sharpened, scanning for threats. 3 figures stood near a fire, their backs turned. A fourth leaned against a post, a rusty spear in his grip, watching the shadows with a bored expression. Thomas clenched his fists. His minions flanked him, waiting. He could feel them, feel their potential. This was no mindless necromancy. This was something more. A menu flickered in his vision. Fleshbound summoning, unique, level 1, summon capacity. 2/3, fleshborn, lesser, unstable, mutating, bone guard, lesser, durable, piercing attacks. 3 summons max at this level? That meant he had room for one more. Thomas's gaze dropped to the corpses of his fallen enemies. The hunger in his mind whispered again. He didn't hesitate. Consume. Shape. Bind. The bodies convulsed. Flesh melted, bones cracked and fused, reshaping into something new. The 3rd summon rose. A hulking meat-stitched brute, its muscles rippling with grotesque density. Its face was featureless, save for 2 hollow slits where eyes should be. New summon acquired. Huskborn brute. Lesser, traits. Heavy strikes, high durability. A chuckle rumbled in Thomas's throat. Perfect. His eyes flicked back to the camp. 4 enemies. He had 3 monsters, more than enough. His fingers curled, the mental link between him and his creations surging with command. Go. The bone guard moved first, silent, a blur of sharpened ivory. It reached the spear-wielding guard in seconds, its clawed fingers piercing through his throat before he could utter a sound. The body slumped. The other 3 turned at the sound, eyes going wide. What the? The fleshborn was already on them. It tore into the first man, claws ripping through leather and flesh like paper. The second drew his sword, too slow. The huskborn smashed into him, sending him flying into the fire pit. His screams were short-lived. The last bandit ran. Thomas's smirk widened. Coward. He lifted a hand, feeling the raw pulse of his power. The bone guard reacted instantly, hurling its sharpened rib bone like a spear. The projectile whistled through the air, and struck true. The bandit stumbled, gurgling, then collapsed. Silence settled over the camp, broken only by the crackling of fire. Thomas stepped forward, taking in the carnage. Blood soaked the dirt. His creatures had slaughtered them in moments. And he had felt everything. The rush of it, the power, the efficiency, sent a thrill up his spine. His summons turned to him, awaiting his next command. Thomas exhaled slowly. This world had thrown him away. Now, it would kneel. Ding. You have leveled up, new stat points available, new skill branches unlocked. Thomas grinned. Time to evolve. Chapter 3. Baptized in blood. The taste of power lingered on Thomas's tongue like iron, raw, intoxicating. His breath came steady despite the bodies littering the ground, their blood soaking into the dirt beneath his boots. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't disgusted. He was alive. A translucent glow flickered in his vision as his user interface responded to his level up. Level up. Name. Thomas. Race. Human. Level. 2. Stat points available. 5. Skill points available. 3. New trait unlocked. Abyss touched. Lesser. Your body and soul have begun adapting to the darkness. Minor resistance to fear and pain. Your summons gain plus 5% increased durability. Thomas exhaled, letting the notifications settle into his mind. He barely remembered who he was before waking up in the pit, but none of that mattered anymore. This world had tried to kill him, and he had killed it right back. He eyed his stat distribution. Stats: Strength 10, Dexterity 9, Endurance 11, Intelligence 12, Wisdom 10, Charisma 7, The numbers had meaning now. He felt stronger, sharper. His body no longer ached like before, and his mind hummed with unnatural clarity. No wasted points, he muttered, scanning the options before making his choices. +2 intelligence, boosts magic-based abilities, including summoning control. +2 endurance, better survival, stamina, and pain resistance. +1 strength, for raw physical ability. Just in case. A subtle warmth spread through him as the changes took hold, his muscles tightening slightly, his thoughts sharper. His skill points were next. Fleshbound summoning. Unique, level 1, summon capacity. 3/3, expand with upgrades. Available paths. Flesh artisan, enhance the customization of your creations. Necrotic dominion, boost control and raw strength of undead summons. Abyssal evolution. Thomas's gaze lingered on the third option. Abyssal evolution. Unlike the other two, it had no details. A mystery. And yet, something in him ached for it. Skill point allocated. Abyssal evolution. The moment he chose it, a surge of cold fire licked through his veins. A new understanding settled in the back of his mind, a quiet voice whispering of things that could be reshaped, refined, reborn. A new notification appeared. New ability unlocked. Abyssal rebirth. When a summon is destroyed, it does not vanish. It evolves. Evolution is unpredictable. The abyss does not grant mercy. Thomas smirked. Now that's interesting. He turned his attention back to the camp. The bandits were dead, their belongings now his. The fire crackled, casting long shadows over the crude wooden barricades. A single path led out into the wilderness, dark trees stretching into the unknown. And then, there was the cage. His eyes narrowed. A rusted iron cage sat a few feet from the fire pit, partially covered by a torn cloth. Inside, a figure lay curled, barely moving. Not alone, after all. The caged girl. Thomas approached carefully, his summons flanking him. The fleshborn twitched restlessly at his side, and the bone guard stood motionless, its sharpened frame still dripping with fresh blood. He ripped the cloth away. The girl inside was filthy, her dark hair matted with sweat and grime. She wore ragged, torn clothes that barely held together, and her wrists were bound in rusted chains. But her eyes, when they snapped open, were sharp. The moment she saw him, she scuttled back against the bars, teeth bared. You're not one of them. It wasn't a question. Thomas studied her. She looked tough, despite the dirt and malnourishment. Lean, built for movement, with a wildness in her gaze that suggested she had fought before. Not anymore, he said simply. They're dead. She hesitated, glancing past him to the bodies. Her lips parted slightly. You killed them? Me? He smirked. No, they did. He stepped aside, allowing her a full view of his monsters. She froze. Her breath hitched as she took in the fleshborn's writhing mass and the bone guard's sharpened frame. Her fingers curled, and for a moment, he saw fear. But only for a moment. Her expression shifted, from fear to calculation. She had the look of someone who had seen worse. Finally, she exhaled. You planning to kill me too? If I wanted you dead, you'd already be part of them, he said bluntly, nodding to his creations. Silence stretched between them. Then, she laughed, dry and humorless. Hell, that's fair. Thomas crouched beside the cage. Who are you? The girl wiped dirt from her cheek with her bound hands. Alara. And these bastards? Slavers, she spat, hatred burning in her tone. Raiders. Filth. They were planning to sell me off at the next trade post. Thomas's eyes flicked toward the corpses. Well, they're not selling anyone anymore. Alara stared at him for a long moment before a slow smirk spread across her face. No, I guess they're not. She shifted, tugging at her chains. So, you gonna let me out, or are you just here to gloat? Thomas considered her. He had no idea if she was trustworthy. Hell, for all he knew, she could be just as dangerous as the men he had killed. But something about her, her defiance, her fire, intrigued him. And he could use allies. Without a word, he grabbed a key from one of the fallen bandits and unlocked the cage. Alara rubbed her wrists, wincing. Then, she stood. Well, then, she muttered, rolling her shoulders. Looks like I owe you one. Thomas grinned. Damn right you do. Alara met his gaze, and something flickered between them, something dangerous. And just like that, the game had changed. Chapter 4. Shadows of the Past. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows against the trees. The stench of blood still lingered in the air, thick and metallic, but Thomas had long since stopped noticing. He sat against a fallen log, sharpening a blade he had looted from one of the dead slavers. Across from him, Alara stretched out on a bedroll she had stolen from the same corpses, rubbing her wrists where the chains had dug into her skin. She hadn't spoken much after they left the camp behind. Now that the initial rush of survival had passed, tension still sat between them. Not quite distrust, but not yet familiarity. Thomas glanced at her. "So, are we gonna talk, or are we just gonna pretend none of this happened?" Alara snorted, shifting slightly to face him. "Which part? The part where I was locked in a cage, or the part where you turned men into fucking meat puppets?" A smirk tugged at the corner of Thomas's mouth. "Both." She exhaled sharply. "Yeah, fair enough." She was silent for a moment, her eyes flickering toward his creatures. The fleshborn sat near the tree line, its pulsing, unnatural mass still as if waiting for orders. The bone guard, with its jagged form, stood motionless at his back. Even he hadn't fully adjusted to them yet. "You've got a hell of a talent, I'll give you that," Alara finally said. Thomas chuckled. "Yeah? Doesn't freak you out?" She raised an eyebrow. "Oh, it absolutely freaks me out. But I don't get the luxury of being squeamish." Thomas nodded, appreciating the honesty. He'd seen her reaction earlier, fear, but not weakness. She had assessed him, weighed her options, and chosen to survive. He respected that. "So," he said, leaning back, "what's your deal, Alara? How'd you end up in that cage?" Alara stared into the fire, her expression hardening. "Same way most people do. Bad luck." Thomas didn't push. He just waited, watching as she wrestled with her own thoughts. Finally, she sighed. "I used to run with a mercenary crew," she admitted. "Not a big one. Just a handful of us. We took contracts, hunted bounties, sometimes worked as caravan guards. Nothing too serious, just enough to stay alive." Her fingers curled into the fabric of the bedroll. "Then we took the wrong job." Thomas said nothing, letting her continue. "Some noble's brat got kidnapped. We were supposed to track down the kidnappers and bring her back alive. Straightforward, right?" A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "Turns out the whole thing was a setup. Some other noble wanted the girl dead, and we walked right into an ambush." Thomas frowned. "You were betrayed?" She nodded. "Half my crew was killed in the first few minutes. The rest of us ran." She exhaled, eyes distant. "I made it further than most. Thought I lost them. Turns out, I just ran into another problem, those bastards." She jerked her chin toward where the slavers' bodies used to be. "Guess they figured I'd sell for a good price." Thomas could see the hatred simmering beneath her words. "You were lucky I showed up when I did," he said. Alara smirked. "Yeah, and here I was thinking you were the lucky one. You'd be dead in a ditch without me keeping watch right now." Thomas snorted. "Bold of you to assume I need watching." Alara arched an eyebrow. "Oh, I don't assume, I know. You've got power, sure, but you're still new to this. You don't move like a fighter. You don't think like a survivor yet. You're smart, but you're reckless." Thomas tilted his head. "And you're not?" She grinned. "Oh, I'm absolutely reckless. But I know when to run." They shared a brief silence, the crackling fire filling the space between them. Then Thomas asked, "So what now? You got plans?" Alara hesitated. "Not really." She looked at him curiously. "What about you? Where the hell did you come from?" Thomas stiffened slightly. He had no past. No real memories before waking up in this world. There were flashes, a different place, different rules, but it was all fragmented, slipping through his fingers whenever he tried to focus. "I don't know," he admitted. "I woke up in a pit, half buried in dirt, and the first thing I saw was my own status screen." Alara blinked. "Shit, that's not normal." "No kidding," he muttered. She studied him for a long moment. "You're not like most people, are you?" Thomas chuckled darkly. "No, I don't think I am." Silence again. But this time, it wasn't awkward. It was understanding. Alara broke the quiet first. Tell you what, she said, leaning forward. Since neither of us has a plan, why don't we stick together for a bit? Strength in numbers and all that. Thomas smirked. And what do you bring to the table? Alara grinned. Oh, I don't know. Tracking, stealth, combat skills, the ability to stab someone in their sleep without waking them up. Thomas laughed. Charming. She shrugged. I try. He considered her offer. Having an ally would help. He was strong, his summons were stronger, but he still had limits. Having someone who understood this world could be the difference between thriving and dying. Finally, he nodded. All right, we stick together. For now. Alara smirked. For now. She stretched out with a yawn. We should get some rest. We've got a long road ahead of us. Thomas nodded but didn't move just yet. His mind buzzed with everything that had happened. He wasn't alone anymore. For the first time since waking up, he felt like he had a direction, a reason to keep going beyond just survival. He glanced at Alara one last time as she lay down, her breathing evening out. Then he turned his gaze to the darkness beyond the firelight. Something was out there. He could feel it. Something was watching. And it was waiting. Chapter 5. Strength in shadows. The morning sun bled through the trees, golden light breaking the mist that clung to the ground. Thomas sat cross-legged on a patch of damp earth, his eyes locked on the fleshborn standing before him. Its pulsating, sinewy mass of stitched-together muscle shifted ever so slightly, awaiting his command. Alara crouched nearby, sharpening a dagger against a whetstone. She watched him with mild curiosity, but he could tell she was also analyzing him, gauging his control, his limits. All right, he muttered under his breath, gripping the dirt beneath his fingers. Time to push this further. He focused, feeling the bond between himself and the summoned creature. His mind pulsed with the presence of his creations, each thread of connection like an invisible leash leading back to his core. The fleshborn twitched. He pushed harder, attempting to refine the link, to mold its movements more deliberately instead of just giving broad mental orders. Step forward, he commanded. The fleshborn jerked, then moved, but it was sluggish, unnatural. Its stitched limbs wobbled as it took a clumsy step. Thomas gritted his teeth. No, smoother, controlled. He concentrated, adjusting his approach. Instead of forcing movement through sheer will, he imagined the creature's body as an extension of his own, its legs, his legs. Its weight, his weight. Another step. This time, fluid. A grin tugged at his lips. You're improving, Alara noted. Thomas exhaled, sweat beading at his brow. It's not enough. These things are strong, but I need them to be faster. More coordinated. Alara sheathed her dagger and stood, stretching. Then train them like fighters. He raised an eyebrow. How? She smirked. Watch. In a blur of motion, she darted forward, drawing her second dagger and slashing at the fleshborn's side. Thomas barely had time to react. The creature flinched back, but not fast enough. Alara's blade cut a shallow gash across its unnatural skin, black ichor seeping from the wound. Thomas surged to his feet. What the hell? Commanded to defend itself, she interrupted, eyes locked on him. React, Thomas. His pulse pounded. He focused, forcing the fleshborn to raise its arms, attempting to block her next strike. But she was too fast. Her second blade slipped past its defenses, nicking its shoulder. Thomas clenched his jaw. No, not good enough. He inhaled, feeling the creature's body again. Instead of reacting after Alara attacked, he tried to predict, to sense when she would move. She lunged, and this time, the fleshborn dodged. Alara stopped mid-motion, grinning. Now you're getting it. Thomas exhaled sharply, his heart hammering. That was a hell of a way to teach me. She shrugged. You learn best under pressure. He couldn't argue. For the next few hours, they drilled, Alara striking with swift, precise attacks, forcing Thomas to refine his control. The fleshborn adapted, becoming more responsive, reacting before the strikes landed rather than just taking damage. Each time Alara pushed harder, Thomas pushed back. By midday, he was drenched in sweat, his mind aching from the constant strain. But he had improved, and he wasn't the only one. Alara had been practicing too. She moved with purpose, testing new angles, refining her footwork. Whenever Thomas's summons countered her, she adjusted instantly, never predictable, never giving the same attack twice. They were both getting stronger. Rest and reflection. The sun had dipped toward the horizon by the time they finally stopped. Thomas sat against a tree, his body heavy with exhaustion. Alara sat beside him, stretching out her legs. Not bad, she admitted. He smirked. Coming from you, I'll take that as high praise. She chuckled, then fell silent. A comfortable quiet settled between them, the kind that only came after shared struggle. After a few moments, Thomas spoke. You really know how to fight. You weren't just a mercenary, were you? Alara hesitated. Then, she sighed. No, I had a teacher. He turned to her, curious. Who? She stared at the sky. My mother. That surprised him. She was a fighter? Alara nodded, a small, almost nostalgic smile playing at her lips. One of the best I've ever known. She taught me everything. How to use a blade, how to track, how to survive. Said the world wouldn't be kind to someone like me if I wasn't strong. Thomas frowned. Someone like you? Alara's expression darkened slightly. Someone without a name, without protection, no noble blood, no family legacy, just another disposable person in a world that only cares about power. Thomas understood that feeling all too well. And what happened to her? He asked quietly. Alara's fingers curled slightly. She's gone. Thomas didn't push for details. He could see in her expression that the pain was still raw, still close. Instead, he simply said, she'd be proud of you. Alara blinked, turning to look at him. For a moment, there was something vulnerable in her gaze. Then, she smirked. Damn right, she would. Thomas chuckled, shaking his head. They sat in silence for a while longer. Eventually, Alara nudged him. And what about you? Thomas exhaled. Not much to tell. I woke up in this world with nothing. No past, just this power. And the more I use it, the more it feels right. Like I was meant for this. Alara studied him. Most people would be terrified by something like that. Thomas smirked. Most people aren't me. She grinned. No, they're not. The fire crackled between them, casting long shadows across the ground. They were still learning, still growing, but one thing was clear. They were stronger together. And this was just the beginning.